In this presentation, I'd like to give an update on some of the work that's been conducted in Objective 1. This is around assessing market trends and trajectories that may influence the adoption of alternative farming systems. This kind of follows the framework that we tried to use within the program, as I set out in an earlier presentation. We really try to understand what is the demand and drivers and trajectories of the cassava sector and other aligned sectors, be they competing value chains or alternative uses of land and other resources at a village level. So working from that global level down to a household level, on this objective, we're really trying to reflect on what's happened in the past, where are we going, and what does that mean for the types of technologies that we may co-design with farmers and value chain actors. So in terms of the project design, Objective 1 relates to the blue squares. So firstly, as I said, to really document what has gone in the past, what has been adopted, what has been rejected, in what context has it been adopted, so in what particular biophysical conditions and what market context. Secondly, we wanted to get beyond cassava and look at some of the other commodity value chains that have some similar characteristics. So you can think about things like sugar and oil palm, coffee as an alternative, with different characteristics that lend to the ease in which you can implement some type of industry-led certification that may add value to drive sustainability through the value chain. So we wanted to reflect on where other sectors are at and what can we learn from those approaches. Once we got into this multi-stakeholder innovation hub, we wanted to work with farmers, men and women, and also value chain actors to discuss what are the characteristics of different systems or technologies that are important so that we can use them in an evaluation process. So not to go and say what specific technologies or crops are you interested in, but if we were to do something new, what are the important characteristics for you in terms of your prioritization? After there is some of the agronomy work to test and produce data, of course, we want to subject those different interventions to that criteria that we've pre-developed with farmers and other value chain actors. From there, we wanted to look at the scaling potential. So going back to looking at that structure of the value chain and who in that value chain has an incentive to bring technologies to partners. Is there existing actors that we can work with? Is it something we need to try and work with development partners to develop, or is it, for instance, the Asia Development Bank to try and bring in investment in a sector that may go alongside the cassava sector to really stimulate demand for some of these alternative crops? And of course, there's going to be a large policy component around some of this, both at a local level, engaging with districts, governments, provincial governments, but also trying to coordinate better at a national level. So can we have a cassava policy or strategic plan for Laos that different projects doing different parts of or dealing with different parts of the sector can all be part of, and that we have some common goals. And also at a regional level, we know that there's a lot of activities that need to be looked at a regional level. And I'll touch on that again in a minute. So as I said, I don't want to go through these objectives, you can read them, but in terms of what's been done so far, Objective 1.1, Eric will talk about, but we've had a fairly extensive household survey that's provided some really useful insights. We've had a number of focus groups and industry meetings to look at where things are going and what does that mean at the household and farm level and down to the enterprise level. And also we've had focus groups to really start to think about what are the important criteria, and I'll touch on that in this presentation as well. We are starting to get some of that plot and farm level data out of the agronomic activities, and we're starting to plug that into some of these economic and risk analysis. So that's ongoing, and we're looking forward to getting more data to work with. And we're definitely already starting to looking at scaling. As I mentioned, we had before some partnerships under development with the Asia Development Bank in Laos, We're really trying to leverage off the industry in Vietnam and really looking for an opportunity to make sure that we can go beyond a few sites in Cambodia. So that's an important part of the next few years. And finally, we continue to engage with policymakers at different scales, again, up to a regional scale, and trying to bring in associations, trying to bring in the government, and looking at where there is this opportunity for productive public-private partnerships at a local level, through to where we need some pre-competitive investment at a regional level to make sure that we can continue some of these important activities such as breeding into the future. So again, touching on that a point, we really try to emphasize that the cassava economy in mainland Southeast Asia is strongly connected and highly interdependent. At the most basic level that people are aware of, you can see the roots and the chips moving between countries. So Laos exporting chips into Thailand, fresh roots into Vietnam, Cambodia also exporting a lot of fresh roots into Vietnam for export, processing in Tay Ninh, dried chips going previously into Thailand. So we know that there's movement of these raw products. We also know that there's a network that's moving planting material around. In the past, they were existing varieties that were moving across borders, and Eric will show some of the results of the fingerprinting that really just shows how dynamic that system is. Unfortunately, that was one of the main drivers of the rapid spread of disease, which saw CMD basically reach most of the region, with the exception of Laos, within the last 10 years. We also know there's foreign investment, so a lot of Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese investments in Laos and Cambodia in the processing sector. So it's really important that we do try to take this regional approach. There's not much point having working in one country when most of the actors and the decision makers are sitting in a different country. In terms of the market, we've gone through a fairly volatile time over the last few years, but even beyond. And a lot of that comes back to supply shocks, both in the region. So a lot of the spikes that you see going up there are related to specific supply shocks. So you can see the mealybug shock. I'll try and bring up a laser pointer if I can. So this is to deal with mealybug, which the biological control got under control. When we see some of these dips, this is related to a maize policy change in China. So again, this is not directly linked to the cassava sector, but because of that tight linkage, we do see things like this. This is when CMD arrived, and it's not the sole reason why prices did go up. Again, a supply shock. There was a lot of flooding during this period, and also periods of drought in some areas where there was low germination, which impacted supply. So we have some recovery, but the supply challenge brought about through CMD has continued to put pressure here, and there was also, as you'll see on a subsequent slide, some support by the maize price. However, that maize price did fall away, and we can see where we've ended up at the moment. So just touching again on that maize story, the tight linkages between Southeast Asia cassava and Chinese maize. Again, you can see the Chinese policy here, which reduced maize prices by removing the floor, and cassava prices throughout the region followed. Again, this is the starch price here that came up, and during this period here, cassava really did get away from maize. It was trading at a premium, which is nice for a short period, but the market does start to restructure and find alternatives. The maize price did catch up though during that period, so we had farmers enjoying fairly high prices. There was still strong demand for the product, but as maize fell away, we still had those supply problems, and cassava was trading at a premium, and if there was only one way that was going, unfortunately, and we've ended up back down here, which is still not a bad price when you look at it at this graph, but farmers tend to have a fairly short memory, but we also must remember that a lot of costs have increased significantly during that time. So even though prices may have returned to some long-term trend or averages, all the input prices have gone up, meaning that the returns are much slimmer than they were previously. So this is just another way to look at how tight that and strong those price signals through the different markets are, from starch and chips. You can see they follow each other fairly closely. There are some periods where the chip demand does mean that the chips have pulled away a little bit from starch, which makes the starch processors a little bit challenged to compete for the roots and then sell their starch. But all actors are very much in the same boat and are facing the same level of uncertainty and fluctuations. So again, you can see that we went through a period very recently when a lot of this field work has been done, where prices were falling down to some pretty historic lows, not as bad as they were back in 2015. But at these prices, and again with the increase in costs, it's really starting to make cassava somewhat marginal when you have productivity declining at the same time. Just again, farmers obviously have a multiple of activities that they can potentially engage with depending on the area they're farming. The main substitute in the short term in some locations that farmers are thinking between is obviously cassava or maize, and in some locations sugar is the third one in there. That's something that farmers may make a decision on an annual basis. Do I grow cassava? Do I grow maize? And as you can see, those alternatives haven't been very attractive in the recent years either. So it's not that cassava has been especially bad. It's just it pulled back a little bit later than maize, and sugar has been depressed for some time. Some of those long-term investments, so tree crops, coffee, rubber, and palm oil, you can see that with the exception in the last few years where coffee prices have really accelerated, some of those other options haven't been that attractive. Rubber, for instance, was an option that many farmers had taken in the past, probably before this index kicks in. But it is something that we do see farmers continue to see as an alternative, this long-term investment into the future. We do see these coffee prices in southern Laos, for instance, starting to reverse some of the trend that we saw with poorer performing coffee removed from the landscape during this period. Now we do see farmers replanting coffee and better coffee. So when we do talk to farmers about their price expectations, it's very clear that all they have to make their decisions off is what they can see in their local environment. So we will talk to them about what they think the average, what they think the price next year will be, or within the current season, and they'll say something like, "Well, this year there's been a lot of drought. There was a bad germination, so there's going to be a shortage of supply. So we think the price will go up." And that's true to some levels. Different value chain actors will have to compete a little bit harder when the root supply is low. But as I said previously, those larger trends are really driven by those global processes. So what's happening in global maize? So one of the main things we want to start to do is, if we can understand where that global maize is and we can make nice graphs, how do we start to communicate some of the information out to farmers that they can feed in to their decision support tools, basic calculations? Do I plant cassava? Do I intensify? Do I look at another crop? So as part of that household survey that Eric's going to talk on, we did ask people, do you plan to plant cassava next year? And as you can see, across Laos and Cambodia, with a few exceptions, almost 98%, 80-90% said that they were looking to plant cassava next year. But at the same time, we did ask them around their price expectations. What did they think the most likely price would be? How low did they think the price might be? And how high the price might be? So this was really interesting to see when people are making those decisions, what are they expecting? And as you can see, in some cases, there's some very optimistic farmers uh, and some that are a little bit more realistic. I've just plugged some prices in there from last week, but you can see in some cases those expectations were fairly aligned with where things have got to. Some of those low prices in Cambodia did come to fruition and probably a little bit worse than what farmers were expecting. So we worked with farmer groups then to develop some enterprise budgets. So this is just a summary of the ones in Laos. So you can see 4 different districts in 3 provinces. This is just an average scenario. So this is what farmers thought on average yields were in their areas. So in Lao Nham in Salavan province, very nice soils. Yields are still very high. In Tatang, just around the corner, yields are much lower, largely due to disease. Bolikan, an area that's been cultivated for some time, already down to 20. And then in Vientiane district, yields are on average around 15 was an expected yield. The prices vary a little bit, largely due to transport costs, but in that Tatang case, most farmers were already making dried chips rather than selling fresh fruits. At that prices, they thought, given the opportunity cost of labour, it made sense for them to make dried chips. What we try to do is calculate the net returns or the gross margin, so deducting all the cash costs and the value of household resources. So what's the value of your own labour goes into that calculation. We also calculate what we call the returns to household owned resources. So essentially we're taking off the cash costs and showing what is left when you consider that the family labour and the family farm are not costed. This is essentially a cash flow analysis. So if that's negative, we do have serious problems. If it's still positive, it means that you'll have at least a positive return to labour. We'd like to calculate that return to labour, so that's taking that returns to household owned resources and dividing it by the number of days labour that is invested. We find that is a useful calculation for people to compare with the opportunity cost, be that the labour cost for growing cassava, which you can see in the row below. So in some cases, the daily wage rate for cassava growing is only a bit over $4 due to the inflation and the devaluation of the kip. In other cases, it's pushing $10, where a much more shortage of local labour. One of the there's 2 useful things I like to compare it to. One is the daily wage in Thailand, so around 400 baht per day, roughly at the moment. So around $12.50 might be something that a farmer might be deciding, do I migrate or do I stay on the farm? So I tend to find that as a useful calculation. So you can see in some cases there, the returns to labour are above what you would make migrating and working in a factory or in a shopping centre in Thailand. The other one I like to compare is, what's a monthly salary of a NAFRI staff worker, for instance. So it is around $100 a month at the moment. So you can see you only need 1.25 tons of cassava and you're already making more than a government employee. So whilst the returns are low at these low prices, you are still making money competitive with some of the government opportunities. We don't just take averages though. So what we try to do then again is to take what they think is the most likely price, the highest price and the low price, and also looking at different yield scenarios. So what happens in poorer soils, what happens in better soils, and looking at different scenarios in terms of those 3 criteria. So the returns, the gross margin, the net returns to household owned resources, and the returns to labour. This is a case from Lao Nham district in Salavan. So again, those better soils where you can see some farmers wanted to use a scenario of 45 tonnes per hectare. So very, very good production. And then what they thought was the lowest type scenario was still 20 tonnes per hectare, so still good returns. And you can see the wide variation across that plain. So from making a returns to Labor Day of $51 through to the worst case scenario when you're only making $3. In these scenarios too, we did have people who were doing some hand weeding and some who were exclusively using herbicide. So again, you can start to look at how labor-saving technologies influence those different criteria or metrics. So if you start using herbicides, you've obviously got more cash costs, but you're using less labor days. So there's about 80 less days of weeding when you move to the herbicide scenario. This is the case from Sekong in Tatang district. This is an area where you can see the highest fresh root yield that farmers wanted to use is still a very attractive yield, 36 tonnes. But they also, again, we've converted that down to chips in terms of prices. So 36 tonnes, roughly 50-50 conversion they thought was appropriate. And then yields did get very low, so down to 10 tonnes, especially where there was a lot of cassava witches broom disease. And at these prices, things got pretty negative, especially at current prices. So these is the scenarios they wanted to use last year when we did this. So this is the prices for dried chips. So 4,500 they saw as an upper limit, 3,500 most likely, and then 2,500 for what they consider a low price. You can see there, again, at that low price, low yield scenario, you're making negative net returns or a negative gross margin. So that means that your returns to household labor is below the opportunity cost. One of those things that I mentioned previously that was driving that was the large incidence of cassava witches broom disease. And this has been in several years running now. So we would have farmers that were, in this area here, only getting 10 tonnes converted to 5 tonnes of chips due to witches broom disease. And then we would ask them, well, what planting material have you used this year? And they would say, well, we've got no money, so we had to reuse the same planting material. So it's a downward spiral. This is an interesting trial, though. You can see here, this is one of CIAT's lines that were introduced prior to CMD, and we didn't do much with it because it's not resistant to CMD, but you can see that a very clear segregation in terms of resistance to witches broom, anecdotally. So this is under more review, and we're hoping that we can start to identify some varieties or some clones that can be progressed and developed for areas where there's higher witches broom. This is an example from Bangtong. Again, this is where yields were much lower. So even the high yield was 25 tonnes, but we're getting down to this 10 tonne yield. So starting to hit these low levels. And also the price there, low price of around 1,100. That's about $50 US in today's terms. So you can see in these scenarios, negative gross margins, but we're starting to get negative cash flow. So this is where your cash outlays are more than what your gross income is from sales. Again, when things are high, you're getting these good returns. So if farmers can maintain yields at 25 tonnes, even at a low price scenario, you're getting a return around the opportunity cost of labour in that village. And of course, when prices go up, a very attractive return. This is just a photo of one of the focus groups in Bolikan district. So again, men and women coming together. Often they're different information, and we really try to triangulate this. But this is just it's more of a way to communicate scenarios than trying to come up with really exact numbers. So we go back and forth and we have a lot of debate about different scenarios and different costs. We can then calculate at what price would you break even, or at what yield do you break even, and start to have a discussion around at what price would you stop growing cassava, or at what yield would you stop growing cassava? Which is really interesting because we find people are much more price sensitive. So they'll say, oh, look, if the price gets below this, I will stop growing cassava and do something else. But if we go the other way and say, at what yield would you stop growing cassava? Often they'll say, oh, no, I would continue to grow some cassava. So it's even though the outcome in terms of the returns may be getting you to the same place, there is a different response to yield and price declines. When we go to Cambodia, this was we needed to use a little bit of a different approach because in this case, there's a lot more hiring of everything. So a farmer may even hire or rent land to grow cassava, and then they would grow, hiring all labor for every activity. So everything was a cash outlay. And you can see how exposed farmers become when they've put everything into cash. So now even your net returns to household owned resources is very low. In this case, this wasn't even including the renting of land, but you're starting to lose in terms of cash, you know, $700 per hectare, which starts to accumulate in debt. So this is the situation that we see in some of those western parts of Cambodia. Uh, the returns to labour when things are good, 30 tonnes per hectare. But as things decline, you really start to see how this exposes farmers to long-term impacts. So from those discussions, just a couple of summaries. Like in a lot of the locations we're working, there's very limited short-term alternatives when cassava becomes uneconomic. It's not like in a lot of places you can easily switch to sugarcane, you can easily switch to maize, and those prices tend to move together anyway. So it's not like we're seeing a very rapid response to these price changes, and people are tending to follow cassava down as prices decline and as yields decline. What we do see, there is some contraction to areas that can be farmed with family-owned resources. So of course, no renting of land because that's taking cash, but also trying to come back to an area where you don't have to hire labour to help cultivate. We did even see in some villages where there were some agreements where the price they were paying each other for labour had been reduced in order to help offset some of those cash flow issues. We do expect to see, in terms of that contraction, areas closer to factories or the borders and markets to try and limit those transport costs. But when we do start to get that net return to household labour, that return to Labour Day, below and well below that opportunity cost, we do expect to see more migration of young farmers out of agriculture and looking for new opportunities. This has been exacerbated a little bit with some of the issues around Khmer having to return to Cambodia from Thailand, where there's a strong demand at the moment for labourers in construction and manufacturing. But a key takeaway really has to be that maintaining productivity is essential for cassava to continue to be an ongoing productive activity for rural communities. So in the first instance, this does mean getting on top of disease, be it disease-free stems and the resistant varieties, but also looking at adoption of appropriate fertilizer and other cropping system activities. But I think fertilizer is an interesting one that we will come back to, even though it's not a primary part of the project. Labour-saving technologies are going to become increasingly important. It does enable households to diversify their livelihood and to migrate by choice rather than by need into better opportunities. But that adoption of labour-saving technologies can't come at the expense of exposing yourself to huge cash flow issues. So you can't hire everything and then be extremely vulnerable to a price shock. Labour-intensive systems in terms of these cropping system interventions are going to continue to be unattractive. So we know some of the practices in the past uh, have a higher labour requirement. This is going to continue to be a challenge. What we do see in cases is that farmers are diversifying. So at some level, we said, what would you do? Like, what is your strategy? And they said, well, look, if I can't do anything, I can grow upland rice. I won't sell any of it, but at least I've got something to eat. So in some cases, there is a little bit of upland rice that farmers are starting to consider growing just for household consumption. But that, again, is very labor intensive, and I haven't actually seen a huge amount of that happening. Other cash crops in the rotation, in the better soils, we'll show some photos. We do see some of these other cash crops in the rotations. Livestock feed is something that we continue to throw out there as an opportunity. We do see people interested in grazing, so this labour saving option and using some of the pasture-based systems like Rusi that we see in the north, Lao and in Sayaburi, that due to the ease of establishment due to sea. And we see some of these long-term tree crops that were actually popping up in the landscape when cassava prices were high. So this expansion of rubber plantations in parts of Laos, cashews in parts of Cambodia. But again, this has an upfront cost. Cassava has been there in some cases during these establishment years, and it is part of an overall transition rather than necessarily an immediate reaction to some of the degradation and price fluctuations. So in terms of those alternatives, we were trying to understand what are the different characteristics that farmers are interested in. So we started to just uh, put up some of these, and farmers were putting up these and ranking some of them. Some of the things that came out was that, yes, things that will improve soil fertility. There was things around minimizing exposure to drought, so not growing something that would be exposed if the rains didn't come. Equally as important was exposure to excess rain. So there's a lot of flooding happening, and also the issues around root rot that are popping up in the cassava production. There was some mention about, okay, the ease, I can go back to cassava. So if the market crashes for the other one, or but also if I need to come back and I've grown something like pastures, there's been some experience with heavy seed counts, seed drop, and weeds becoming a problem in subsequent cassava crops. Own consumption possible was something that was brought up. So again, I mentioned rice previously, but some of these other crops where you can actually eat some of them. But again, I think this is really a thing of scale, and we'll come back to that in a moment. The ease of being able to sell something, so that there are existing buyers and a value chain, people come to the market, the price is stable. These were something that people were really seeing as important. Cassava is such an easy crop for them to sell. They know the traders, the price has obviously not been stable, but it's not something that's difficult for them to sell. Low upfront investment costs. There's a lot of constraints around setting up some of these other tree-based crops. Access to input. So yeah, it's nice to have these opportunities floated past them, but if they don't know where to get seed or the seed's not available, then that was an important thing. The labour requirement and the returns to labour was something that didn't come up so much in these discussions when we were voting, but whenever you ask someone who's already doing something, why don't you do more of it? It's always, I don't have enough labour. So again, this comes back to this idea of farmers are managing a portfolio of activities, and that we really need to assign some trade-offs. So if you adopt this activity, it also consumes this much labour. So what we want to do from here is start to use some of the literature and the experimental results to give now some options where farmers can choose how much land they would allocate to a different uh, like bundle of characteristics. So how much would they put into a food crop? You know, often people say, yeah, I would grow peanuts. And then you ask them, well, how much peanuts would you grow? And it's like a quarter of a hectare, and they have 5 hectares of cassava. So we really need to understand when people are, explaining what their criteria are, how much of that can they really adopt. But it is much more diverse than people will have you believe. So in southern Laos, there is a history of some of these other crops. So there's a history of peanuts, of sweet potato, of maize, intercropping, and bananas. So we can start to get some of this information to plug into those farm models and start to gamify the situation a little bit. In other locations, it's much more a Swidden landscape. So this is the more undulating areas in Ventong in Laos. You can see the expansion into forest areas has happened. A lot of cassava previously getting grown, and this is areas where I tend to think that we'll see a lot more pasture-based activities and livestock develop the same way as we've seen in other parts of northern Laos. So having said that, we've tried to involve the livestock and forage team from Lao, initially under some of the sustainable intensification activities, but of course Josh is part of the project team, and you'll hear from him. So yeah, we've done some work to look at what the existing livestock systems look like in southern Laos. There is a bit of the start of some of this more intensive feedlots, be this a small scale one and a little bit more here, and some of those are looking at partnering with smallholders, both in terms of backgrounding animals, but also the production of feed. So this is something that we sort of had in mind when we designed the project, but we do really need to start to get some uh, some demonstrations to bring people to. It's very difficult to have conversations around new systems if people have never seen that before. We have had a really productive partnership with the DAFO in Tatang, who's trialled a range of different pastures, so grasses and legumes, and has been feeding it to his own animals, but also having field days and bringing people to look at them. So that's something we hope to continue. And beyond the feed, we have been looking at, well, what is the actual market for some of this seed. So we've got a bit of a collaboration with a seed company in Thailand that is producing crotalaria seed for international markets, to look at whether there is an opportunity to expand his outgrower model of contracted farmers beyond Thailand and into some of into Laos. So this is just a breakdown. You can see some of the prices he's paying at his processing factory at the moment for Crotalaria juncea and Crotalaria ochroluca. So 25.5 baht and 78 baht per kilogram, which I've converted to kip. And then this is just showing how many kilograms of seed you would need to produce to be equivalent to 10 tons of cassava. So in this case, a bit over 260 kilograms of seed would be equivalent at current prices of 10 tons of cassava, which was that low yield scenario. So, the scenarios that we're working off are people potentially getting up to 400, 450 kilograms, but we're really waiting to get the data back in to see what the yields are in some of these systems of growing this. But yeah, we are very aware that we need to take off transport costs to his factory in Sisaket in Thailand. We need to assess some of the quarantine restrictions and the border issues, and things like the tariff arrangements between the US, for instance, and Laos are different to the US and Thailand, and how this sourcing issue will what that will mean. So there's a bit of work to do there, but you'll hear more, I think, in the agronomy team of looking at opportunities for some of these crops to have multiple benefits. So can it be a green manure? Can it be a source of livestock feed? But can it also have some cash income? Can we get two crops of some of these legumes in instead of having this window where we still have nothing in the soil. I just wanted to finally come back and touch on fertilizer. As I mentioned, this wasn't a main thing in terms of the objectives. We've shown in the past the low adoption of fertilizer. Again, here's from the recent survey in Laos and Cambodia. You can see quite the difference between the countries and the provinces. However, we know that fertilizer provides a good response. We know that it's largely economic, and that it's largely, a development demonstration issue rather than new research. But I just wanted to put up some of the intercropping experimental results that we got our hands on from last season, and just show that, without fertilizer, intercropping is not this solution that a lot of people will have you believe. And I'm cherry picking some results here, but you can see here without fertilizer, the cassava soybean, the cassava yield was lower. Cassava mung beans, the cassava yield was lower, and cassava peanuts is roughly the same. So without fertilizer, it's not like you're going to improve soil fertility and continue not to put fertilizer on. So I think we do need to consider the role of fertilizer in this system change, and not think that, and to communicate that we're not going to improve soil fertility through just intercropping or rotations, that we do need to address this underlying issue around low adoption of appropriate fertilizer. As you can see here, when you did put fertilizer on with the intercrop, yes, you did get a significant yield benefit. At low prices, that fell below a 200% marginal rate of return, but at the medium prices, that's above 200% return on investment. And that's without any value to the actual intercrop. So the intercrop didn't have any harvest, however, it did improve the soil conditions and in some other way. Again, this is one trial, but the point I just want to make is that, well, two things. You're not going to get there with just intercropping, and that we need to address some of these issues around the reluctance to introduce chemical fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers to farmers, and I think to include some fertilizer treatments in future cropping system work will be an important aspect. Once again, I'd like to thank ACR for the support of these activities and the partners. There's a lot to do. This is the most challenging part of the project, changing these cropping systems in a range of uncertainty. It's unlikely that we'll get farmers to change their practices when we still have disease issues. So the breeding work, the seed system work is really important before we start to think about some of these long-term options. When we held the focus groups in Cambodia, there was very little interest in discussing alternative cropping systems until we could work out what is the solution for my CMD, what is the solution for my cassava, which is broom disease, and what is the solution to my low prices. So again, the project does have these elements, and they are really interdependent and codependent. Thanks very much.